It's me, Shiza. Today, my mother is going to read Thank You, Mr. Faulker.
So let's start now. Thank you, Mr. Faulker, by Patricia Polacco. Yes, you can turn. Thank you, Mr. Faulker. Wait. To George Faulker, the real Mr. Faulker, you will forever be my hero. Ooh.
Can I read?
Me. The grandpa held the jar of honey so that all the family could see, then dipped a ladle into it and drizzled honey on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. Stand up, little one, he cooed. I did this for your mother, your uncles, your older brother, and now you. Then he handed the book to her. Taste? She dipped her finger into the honey and put it in her mouth. What is that taste? The grandma asked. The little girl answered, Sweet. Then all of the family said in a single voice, Yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made that sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book. The little girl knew that the promise to read was at last hers. Soon she was going to learn to read. Trisha, the littlest girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher, mother, read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books home from school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather or grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all she hoped to read. Each day she saw the kids in the first grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. Not Trisha. Still, she loved being at school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her magic with the crayons. In first grade, you learn to read, her brother said. In first grade, Trisha sat in a circle with other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood, their first reader, sounding out letters and words. They said, Bear, bear, oh boy, la la, look, ook. The teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and get a word right. But when Trisha looked at a page, all she saw were wiggling shapes. And when she tried to sound out words, the other kids laughed at her. Trisha, what are you looking at in that book? They'd say. I'm reading, she would say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person, always when it was her turn to read. Her teacher had to help her with every single word, and while the other kids moved up into the second reader and third reader, she stayed alone in Our Neighborhood. Trisha began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. The harder words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. How she loved to draw, or just sitting and dreaming, or when she could going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandma were walking together in the small woods behind the farm. It was twilight, the air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grass as they walked. Trisha said, Grandma, do you think I'm different? Of course, her grandma answered. To be different is a miracle of life. You see all of those little fireflies? Everyone is different. Do you think I'm smart? Trisha didn't feel smart. Her grandma hugged her. You're the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever. Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading didn't matter so much. Trisha's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side, and she used to say that someday she would be on the other side where the light comes from. One evening they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. You know, Grandma said, all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass or you will lift right off the ground and there you will be. They laughed and both hung on to the grass, but it was not long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass because she went to where the lights were on the other side. And not long after that, Trisha's grandfather let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Tricia would watch to the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that wasn't happening to hers. And numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. Line the numbers up before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Tricia tried, the numbers looked like a stack of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She just knew she was dumb. Then one day her mother announced that she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe though, the teachers and kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. But all the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over words. The ka, at, ran. She was reading like a baby in the third grade. And when her teacher read along with them, she called on Tricia for an answer. She gave the wrong answer every time. Hey, dummy, a boy called out to her on the playground. How come you're so dumb? Other kids stood near him and they laughed. Tricia could feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Now Tricia wanted to go to school less and less. I have a sore throat, she would say to her mother, or I have a stomach ache. She dreamed more and more and drew more and more, and she hated school. Then when Tricia started 5th grade, the school was all a buzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and sleeky grey pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teachers' pets gathered around him, Stevie Joe and Alice Marie, Davy and Michael Lee, but right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Faulker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Faulker would stand behind Tricia whenever she was drawing and whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings. But they still laughed whenever she gave a wrong answer. Then one day, she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy when the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Faulker, in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop! Are all of you so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?"